plenty for us to get stuck into as we bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes.
These are the days that we dread. This morning's tragedy, like the loss of 27 people on 1 November day last year, is the most sobering reminder possible of why we have to end these crossings.
Well, that was the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, to a sombre House of Commons. Her statement came just after a far more combative PMQs, which was focused on strikes.
In 12 hours' time, there's a nurses' strike. All he needs to do is meet the nurses. His inaction speaks volumes. As ever with this Prime Minister, it's Tory politics first, patience second.
Well, the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, making it clear who he blames for the strikes, but Rishi Sunak was also quick to exploit any awkwardness that Labour might feel over the subject.
If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so. What's weak, Mr. Speaker, is he's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
Well, with major strikes in everything from rail and mail to the NHS and more on almost every day of this month, it's a subject that we're likely to be discussing for a while yet. And as it's our very last programme of the year, we're going to be asking our panel to reflect on an extraordinary 12 months in politics and to give us their Politician of the Year. So it'll be interesting to hear their choices. We've also got some top guests for you, including the Royal College of Nursing General Secretary Cullen. For the government, we'll talk to the Health Minister Maria Caulfield, and we'll also be talking to Labour's Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. Much more besides on The Take. Hello, good evening. Well, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, expressed his sorrow at the deaths in the English Channel today. Suella Braverman called it a day we dread. So far, we know that 4 people have died, but others do remain in hospital. Almost 50 people were rescued in the bitter cold and dark of the early hours when their small boat capsized. Meanwhile, the first ever strike in the 106-year history of the Royal College of Nursing will go ahead tomorrow. So let's crack straight on, shall we? We're going to start with the most important stories of the week so far.
Specialist police divers have been searching through the night at a freezing lake in Solihull near Birmingham. 4 children were pulled from the water.
One of my officers was trying to punch through the ice to actually rescue the children themselves.
3 of the 4 boys who were pulled from the lake have very sadly died.
A major row has erupted between the government and trade unions over exactly who's to blame for the winter strikes.
I went into that room today with hopes, obviously, and came out with not one single brown penny.
20% of train services are running today.
There is a way forward. The government's got to facilitate that, show a bit of goodwill.
I think the tide is turning on opinion about whether these offers are reasonable or not.
Right now, look, private sector wages going up really high, public sector quite weak in terms of wage inflation.
And we are staying with our breaking news that 3 people have died and at least 43 have been rescued after a major incident in the Channel.
These are the days that we dread. This morning's tragedy is the most sobering reminder possible of why we have to end these crossings.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
All he needs to do is meet the nurses. As ever with this Prime Minister, it's Tory politics first, patience second.
If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so. What's weak, Mr. Speaker, is he's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
Well, let's focus now, shall we, on that tragedy in the English Channel and also the nurses' strike that is due to start tomorrow. We can speak live now to the Health Minister, Maria Caulfield, who's on the programme for us today. Thank you so much for being with us. I just want to start on that tragedy. 4 people dying. I mean, it's literally freezing out there in the dark. I mean, how desperate would you have to be to get on that boat?
Well, I think people are desperate, but also they're under criminal gangs who are making thousands of pounds per journey. And I think, as the Home Secretary said in the House of Commons today, that's just a sheer example of why we need to end this practice. There are legal routes into this country which people can follow. We know that a lot of those people who are travelling in the small boats are economic migrants rather than seeking asylum.
Are there legal routes? Because I know that there are safe and legal routes if you're from Hong Kong or if you're from Afghanistan or if you're from Ukraine. But is it true to say there are legal routes into the UK to claim asylum for others?
From our humanitarian perspective, since 2015 we've taken over 400,000 people, and you're right, for people from Ukraine, people from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Hong Kong. And the Prime Minister said when he made his announcement at the dispatch box yesterday that he's willing to look at further, safer legal routes in for people who are claiming asylum. But we have to deal with what's happening now in the Channel, and we know that a significant percentage of those are economic migrants who are illegally entering the country under the rule of these people traffickers, and this is a classic example of why we absolutely must end this. And as the Prime Minister said, enough is enough.
But you appreciate, though, that of course I don't think anyone would dispute that there are economic migrants as well, but there are also people who have faced persecution, and there are no safe and legal routes for many of the people on the boat into the UK to claim asylum.
Well, I think we have been, extremely generous as a country, and I think that, whether it's people opening up their homes to Ukrainian families this year, or whether it's taking in, people from Afghanistan and Hong Kong, we have shown that when people are facing persecution or terror, that we absolutely will take people in. But some of the people that are coming through on the small boats who are claiming asylum, they're coming through many safe countries first before they come here.
Yeah, because there are no, that's the point though, isn't it? Because there are no other ways of them to claim asylum.
But there is no reason
why
why
they have to be in the UK in order to put that claim.
But there is no reason why they have to come to the UK to claim asylum. If you're travelling through Germany and France to get here, there's no reason why you have to claim asylum in the UK. And the Prime Minister has been clear, he will look at safe and legal routes, but we cannot continue with this, the numbers of people crossing in those small boats. We know it's putting pressure on our health service, on our schools, on housing. And part of his 5-point plan is reducing the cost of, we're currently spending millions of pounds a day on hotels and putting people up. But, it's not fair on people who come here legally that there are ways into this country that, are bypassing all the rules.
I was having a look when I was researching, this interview about the percentage of asylum cases that have been decided within 6 months, and I was pretty shocked, actually. It's plummeted from over 80% in 2014, decided within 6 months, to less than 10% in 2022. The turnover of asylum caseworkers in 2021 to 22 was 40%. I mean, what on earth is going on? This looks like a system that's completely broken.
Well, I think the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have acknowledged the failings in the system. I think the Prime Minister was very honest about that and has set up, the 5-point plan where he wants to get through the backlog of claims by the end of next year, that he's putting extra resources into dealing with those claims, and that also that tougher enforcement, that, if people come here illegally, they won't be able to stay and return and claim to stay. So the backlog is one of the key areas of his plan that we absolutely need to get through, because it isn't fair on those people who come here either to be waiting, sometimes years before a decision is made. If people have come here illegally, we need to assess their claim, and then there will be strict enforcement in terms if they've got a legal claim, that will be upheld. If not, then people can't just stay here.
But you acknowledge that under Conservative governments, the situation is nowhere near where it should be.
Well, I think we've had 2 yeyears of COVID, so let's not pretend that we haven't had problems in the last few years.
We're talking about back from 2014.
Yeah, so the Prime Minister has acknowledged that it's one of his key priorities to clear the backlog by the end of next year, because that is one of the problems, that we've not been able to process the claims as quickly as we'd like. He said that from the dispatch box, that he doesn't want to see this in months and years. He wants to see this in days and weeks.
OK. Now I want to talk to you about the nurses' strikes. You were a nurse specialising in cancer treatment at the Royal Marsden, so you understand more than most people what it's like on the front line of our hospitals. I'm sure many of your former colleagues probably, going out on strike from tomorrow. Are they wrong too?
I personally don't support strike action. I don't think their concerns are wrong, and I think I worked as a nurse during the COVID pandemic, and I've worked shifts since as well. So, and dealing with the backlog caused by COVID is, exceptionally hard work.
So what are their concerns then?
So pay obviously is one of those, but I think it's much more than pay. I think it's about the long hours that nurses work. often not finishing on time. They don't get protected learning and development time like doctors do, for example. And skill mix, for example, on the wards. It's not just about numbers on the wards, it's the level of experience and skills that are available too. So when I've met with Pat Cullen, for example, they're the sorts of issues and the Secretary of State wants to talk about in terms of improving the working conditions of nurses. And pay is just a tiny element. And I think the strike action is more about, from talking to my colleagues, is more about their frustration about working conditions rather than pay itself.
So even though you say you don't personally agree with strike action, you've got sympathy for what some of the
I think nurses
have got,
have had a very difficult time. I don't think anyone's denying that. I just don't see what striking achieves. I'm very much, keen to work with Pat and the RCN to look at those conditions, as is the Secretary of State when he met with her this week. But we cannot meet the demands of a 19% pay rise.
Just talking about Pat Cullen and about the meeting with Steve Barclay, because she was pretty disparaging about what came out of that meeting. She said that Steve Barclay showed belligerence, he refused to discuss pay, he was nothing short of disrespectful. I also thought it was interesting to say that she thought the government was displaying macho behaviour towards the RCN because it sees nursing as female work that it doesn't value properly. I mean, it doesn't sound like, she really believes the Health Secretary's got her back.
Well, I'm sorry Pat feels like that. I know Pat very well, and she's a very good leader of the RCN, and I've got nothing but respect for Pat. But we have to be honest that we cannot afford the 19% pay rise demand that they're wanting. That will cost us £10 billion. And as the Prime Minister said at the dispatch box today,
it will cost 10 because there has been some question marks about that figure, hasn't it? It's important to say. The IFS say the government's saying it's £1,000 a household. The IFS says more like £640.
Well, the £1,000 per household is if it was inflation for all the public sector, because we know what would happen if the nurses get an above inflation pay rise. Of course, the ambulance workers will want it. Of course, the teachers will want it. So this is about if we've got an independent pay review body in place that looks at factors such as inflation, skill shortages, recruitment and retention. They come up with a pay recommendation which the government has accepted in full.
So you obviously think that 90% is unaffordable. Nurses are generally being offered around 4%. NHS Scotland is offering 7.5%, still below inflation, but more generous than the current offer on the table for those in NHS England and Wales. What would be a fair pay rise for nurses?
Well, we feel that the independent pay review body to take the politics out of
4%.
And that decision was made. Some nurses are getting more than that. So those on the lower agenda for change pay, some of them are getting close to 9%, but the average is 4%.
It's a recommendation, isn't it, though? I mean, you could overrule it if you wanted. And 4% at a time when inflation figures out this morning are 10.7%. I mean, people are struggling to put food on the table here, aren't they? You can see there's been stories about nurses being forced to use food banks.
Yeah. We could overrule it, but in order to pay for that, we can only pay for that in three ways. The first is to borrow money, and we saw just a few weeks ago when the government borrows money it can't afford, what happens to interest rates and to the market. We could tax people more because it's not the government's money, it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day. We could raise taxes to pay for that. I don't think anyone wants us to do that. Or take it within existing budgets. And that's quite a lot of money at a time when we're trying to clear those COVID backlogs. It would mean taking it away from the surgical hubs we're developing, community diagnostic centres, we're recruiting, say, for example, in mental health, 27,000 extra staff. That's where that money will have to come from. And as a minister, as a government, we have to make those tough choices. And if we've set up an independent pay review body, then we feel we need to honour that. We're taking those factors into consideration, and we've fully implemented that pay review body's recommendations.
I just want to have a look at the comparison between the private sector, what's happening in the private sector, and what's happening in the public sector, because the ONS says that pay growth in the private sector is 6.6% versus 2.2% in the public sector. And you can see there private sector pay going up more generously than public sector pay. Government ministers often say that, we're having to stomach this pain in order to try and beat inflation. But if you're a worker in the public sector, you might be feeling it's a bit unfair. Why should you be the one who's having to bear the brunt of the pain? And you look at the more generous rises been giving in the private sector.
So there are other benefits to being a public sector worker other than pay. Your job security is much
That's
more
not
stable.
Help you pay your energy bill, though.
Well,
right
it does.
Now, is it?
If you're in the public sector, if you're working in retail or commerce, and in the hospitality sector, for example, where they're reducing people's hours because people aren't going out to eat and drink as they would normally. With the train strikes, people aren't going shopping like they would do normally. There's a lot more job insecurity if you're in the private sector. You also don't necessarily get the same sick pay, maternity leave benefits that you do, or pension benefits that you do in the public sector. So, and as I said earlier, pay is only one small part of most nurses' concerns about working life at the moment. When you talk to many of them who are thinking of reducing hours or leaving, actually pay is probably one of the last things that they actually mention. It's the long hours, it's the hard work, it's the skill mix on the wards. We can do something, and we are doing something about that, and pay is just one small consideration in that.
OK, thanks very much for being on the programme. Good to talk to you about two very serious subjects today. Well, we can get some immediate reaction from the Nurses' Union, the women that we've been talking about a little bit in that interview, the Royal College of Nursing, Pat Cullen, and the union says that its members will be walking out tomorrow and it wants direct pay negotiations with the government. Well, let's speak now, shall we, to the General Secretary and Chief Executive, Pat Cullen. Thank you very much for being with me today. We've just heard from Maria Caulfield, who says that the strikes aren't really about pay. They're only a small element about pay and it's more about conditions. Is that right?
No, that's absolutely not true. And I heard Maria describe in quite a disparaging way, pay has just been a tiny thing for our nursing staff. Our nursing staff are on the breadline. They're not able to afford their bills. Some of them aren't even able to afford travel to get to their work, for goodness sake. And yet we have a minister sitting here saying that it's about all of the other things and not about pay. That is absolutely not true. Of course, there are many other terms and conditions we would like this government to sort out for our nurses. Absolutely. But pay is fundamental if we are going to try and keep the nurses we've got in the health service and try and recruit more in. 50,000 vacancies in this country. And if we don't address pay, then I'm afraid most nurses would say to you tonight, they are fearful for where the health service will end up.
Right, let's talk about pay then, shall we? Let's talk about numbers. You opened negotiations asking for 19% pay rise, 5% above inflation. The government said that's unaffordable. What would you accept?
I said we'd get round a table and talk about this. But I heard you mention about the meeting that I had with Steve Barclay a few days back. And once again, brought into a room and told, you can talk about anything you wish to talk to me about, but we will not be talking about pay. And until I can get into a room and talk about pay to the ministers, then I'm afraid I'm not going to negotiate for the hundreds of thousands of nurses that will be on picket lines tomorrow over the airwaves. But they owe those nurses everything to get into a room and start to talk about pay. Surely to goodness, that's the only respectful thing they could do at this stage. Instead of what they're doing, they are allowing those hundreds of thousands of nurses to actually go onto picket lines tomorrow and stand out in the cold when they want to be inside looking after their patients.
But this is kind of the point, though, isn't it? Because you've said yourself that the Health Secretary isn't talking to you about numbers, and yet the government is making a huge play of the fact that you want a 19% pay rise. They clearly feel that plays into their hands, that most people listening will think it's unaffordable. So surely this is your opportunity to give a bit of guidance on what you would accept. So in Scotland, for example, there's been an accepted offer of 7.5%. Would you accept that?
Look, we had an opportunity to stop the spin and start to speak a few days ago. I was very optimistic going to that meeting, hoping that at least we would have some sense shown, and then we could actually have stopped the strike tomorrow. But in fact, that was never going to be on the cards for this government. They brought us into a room, they marched us up to the top of the hill again, and they abandoned our nursing staff, the 320,000 nurses that have voted for strike action. That's an incredible and significant mandate, and you cannot ignore their voices. You absolutely cannot. They're not asking for, as I keep saying, their pockets to be lined with gold. They're wanting a decent decent wage. That isn't, they are entitled to a decent wage. And if we are going to try and address the issues within our health service, we need to retain our nurses that we've got in the health service, those nurses that Maria talked about today on your programme, that are not able to get their annual leave. They're working every hour that's available to them to keep the health service going. And actually, when you talk about the 19%, we never asked for 19%. In February of this year, we submitted our evidence to the pay review body. And at that point, inflation was not sitting where it is now. And then in July, the government accepted the recommendation of the pay review body. I never accepted the recommendations, nor did our nurses. And inflation wasn't where it is now either. So the more they've dragged their heels and the longer they've dragged their heels, inflation has continued to rise, and consequently we're sitting at 19%. But what I would say to Maria and to Steve Barclay and any other minister listening, can you afford not to do this? And indeed, the International Council of Nurses wrote to Steve Barclay this evening and told him plainly and squarely that he cannot afford not to do it either.
So you're saying you never have asked for 19%. Just this is your chance, though, to clear it up. And I know, I understand what you're saying about, you don't want to negotiate on the airways, but I do feel as well that, nurses are going on strike. The public have a right to know exactly what it is you're striking for. I just don't understand why you won't be a bit more specific on what kind of pay rise you think would be, fair.
No, I'm definitely not going to negotiate on the airwaves. And I don't think that any minister should reduce our profession to have to do that. They should do the decent thing and get into a room and negotiate with me. I've also said if they find that maybe isn't suitable for them, that we will do it through conciliation and engage with ACAS. I don't think that's very much for our profession to ask. And I don't think that any minister should suggest or ask that we would negotiate on airwaves and not give us the respect and get into a room with us.
OK. If the government doesn't do what you're asking to, get around the table, negotiate on pay, should we expect to see more nurses' strikes?
Well, the ball's in their court, quite frankly. There will be a second day on the 20th of December. And unless we have talks and unless we are able to negotiate on behalf of my members, then I'm afraid to say that that's a very strong possibility. And already we will be starting to look at when those dates will be.
So what kind of timeframe will you be? You're saying you'll be looking at when that could be. What kind of timeframe are we looking at then, potentially?
I'm afraid that they will continue into January.
OK, that's really interesting to hear. Certainly something sobering as well if you look at the current waiting times for operations in the NHS. What do you think the impacts of the strikes will be?
Well, just when you mentioned waiting lists, I think that's a really important point. Why are those nurses going on picket lines tomorrow and losing a day's pay out of the meagre salaries that this government has insisted that they live on, that they can't live on actually? But our waiting lists are at 7.2 million people in this country waiting year on year on waiting lists, languishing on waiting lists. And why are they? Because we haven't got the nurses to be able to care and treat those patients. So the ministers will continue to talk about if we take money from the elective care waiting lists and give it to the nurses, then we won't be able to address the elective care waiting lists. But you'll address no waiting lists if you do not have the nursing staff to actually care and treat those patients. They're actually one of the same thing. So this is again all part of the spin that's put on this about taking from patients and giving to nurses. It's nurses that look after patients. And without nursing staff, patients in this country are getting a pretty raw deal, sitting on waiting list year after year, when their treatments should be given to them at a time when they require them, and then they can get on and live their fruitful and normal lives and continue to contribute to society, when in fact, because of the ill health and the increases in their ill health and their chronic conditions, they can't do that. So everything leads back. everything leads back to paying nurses a decent wage and ensuring we can recruit staff into the health service and retain those nurses we've got.
I was quite struck by some comments that you made after the meeting with Steve Barclay. You said that you thought the government was displaying particularly macho behaviour towards the Royal College of Nursing because it sees nursing as female work and doesn't value it properly. Do you think there is some sexism in the way that nurses are treated?
I absolutely do. And in fact, again, I refer back to the International Council for Nurses. And they have addressed that in the letter to Steve Barclay this evening as well. So it's a well-known fact that nursing staff is a 90% female profession. And if you think of some of the things that this government has done over this last number of weeks, I have to ask them, would they do that if those statistics were different, if we were not a 90% female profession? So just one example where they have decided that the military can come in and with a few hours of training, take on the role of a nurse, take on the role of caring for patients. And there's not a single nurse in this country would suggest that with a few hours training that they could go out and put on a military uniform and take a gun and do what our military does, because they absolutely could not. But yet it seems to be that the value of caring is brought down to the lowest common denominator, and it can be done by anyone with a few hours training. And that's just so wrong. If you look at what the government has done with saying they're going to put in more draconian legislation to ensure that through their trade unions, nursing cannot have a voice, that's about trying to silence those nurses, the 90% female profession that we are. And I could go on. There's many more examples that I could use. But I'm not alone in thinking this. The International Council of Nurses believe it as well. And indeed, the people that I represent believe it.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Pat Cullen there at the RCN saying that those strikes could be going on into January if there isn't a resolution. Well, a bit later on, we'll get Labour's take on all of that, but let's have a quick chat to our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, first, shall we? Sam, I thought it was pretty interesting to hear Pat Cullen there being pretty clear that if there is no resolution, and it doesn't feel like there is any move towards that right now, we should expect more strikes in the new year.
And it's not just new strikes in the nursing sector, I think, across the other sectors that are facing industrial action. That's the talk at the moment, whether it's rail or elsewhere. And I think that from the two interviews that you've done so far this evening, Sophie, there are clear themes. There are two big challenges that Rishi Sunak's government is actually quite keen to talk about. One is asylum and migration, and the other is how they're going to handle strikes. Both at the moment look incredibly difficult for ministers, but I think Number 10 thinks that they've got a plan on both of them. When it comes to migration, there was the plan announced by Rishi Sunak earlier this week, which will see tough new laws in order to prevent anybody coming in illegally from staying. And when it comes to strikes, it looks as if the government's going to introduce new minimum standards and potentially go further. But there's a big but, Sophie. While Number 10 might be pleased with themselves for getting away from that sense of growing, rolling chaos and focusing on two issues of policy, both of those will be incredibly difficult to deliver. When it comes to migration and boats, there's a question of if there are not legal routes for asylum seekers to come into the country, how is that policy workable? And then when it comes to potentially banning nurses from ever striking or members of some other professions, that is an enormous removal of a right to strike that people have at the moment. And if you take the police sector, for instance, then they actually pay the police more precisely because not only they're not in a union, but they cannot strike. So are we going to pay nurses more after all as we take away their right to strike? I don't think any of that's going to happen. When it comes to legislation, expect stuff weaker to get it through quicker, but nothing is going to happen in a hurry.
Really interesting to talk. And as you say, they can have the policy decisions, but whether or not things follow and they get the results that come in from that is a whole other question. Thanks very much, Sam. You're watching The Take. We're live here in Westminster for you this evening. Up next, we'll be talking to Labour's Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Let's get Labour's take now, shall we, on what we've been discussing this evening so far, especially, of course, that tragedy in the Channel. We can speak now to the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray, who joins us on the programme today. Thank you so much for coming into the studio this evening. I just want to talk about what happened in the English Channel. 4 people dead. The freezing waters, the dark, the phone call that was made in the early hours of the morning. I mean, it's impossible not to look at the details and be very moved by it. What would Labour do?
You're right. When we talk about the details, when you hear about what happened, it's horrific. There's no other word for it. It's truly, deeply upsetting and awful to hear what happened. And I think it really. It should be a wake-up call. It really underscores the fact that we need to do something about people who are being smuggled by people traffickers, by criminal gangs across the Channel. Now, we know that there's been a lot of discussion about this in the media and so on, and in Parliament. And we've been saying for a long time that rather than spend money on things like the Rwanda policy, which we think is unethical and unworkable, that money would be better spent beefing up the capacity of the National Crime Agency to go after the criminal gangs who are smuggling these people in the first place.
It's easier said than done, though, isn't it? If it was easy to break up the people with traffickers, then, yeah, any government would do that, wouldn't they? I mean, I just look at what Interpol says on that. There's a relatively low risk of detection, prosecution and arrest compared to other activities of transnational organised crime. And it's because the relationship between the criminals and the migrants is a temporary one. So the criminals are really hard to trace. They're unknown to the people they're smuggling, that they hide behind pseudonyms, they use rental vehicles, different mobile numbers. I mean, if Labour's not going to be able to bang a bit more money to the National Crime Agency and suddenly it's all going to be sorted.
Well, hard problems are what government has to deal with. Hard problems, whether it's what we're discussing now or the really other big issues like the climate emergency or all of the other challenges that we face. It is government's job, ultimately, to take on these difficult issues. And yes, it's not the case of just snapping your fingers and making things go right. It does require hard work, focus, rolling up your sleeves, sitting down at the table, making sure that you're really delivering the programme that you talk about. And, it is one of the wider problems, not just in relation to this issue, but across the piece. So the government, members of the Conservative Party are so distracted by their own internal party politics within Parliament and trying to hang on to their jobs and doing all of their horse trading and worried about rebellions here and there. They're not focused on delivering the job, which is tackling the really big issues we face.
Let's focus on what Labour would do. Would you open more routes to people to claim asylum legally in the UK? Because obviously one of the issues is that there aren't very many safe and legal routes if you're not from one of the sort of designated countries that has them, like Hong Kong, Ukraine and Afghanistan. Would you like to see it easier for people to claim asylum?
So we need to make some really important changes around, for instance, replacing the Dublin Agreement, making sure that that is there for safe reunions, family reunions, and so on. I think the other part of the equation, which is really important as well, though, is to make sure that when people are in the UK, their applications are processed fairly but speedily. And this is one of the really big problems.
Getting to the UK, isn't it? That's the thing, because at the minute it's you can't get to the UK in a safe and legal route, right? If you're going to only be able to claim asylum when you're in the UK, that's why you come over on a small boat.
Exactly, and that's one of the problems that the Home Secretary, found very difficult at the recent hearing that the Home Secretary had. She wasn't able to explain how the policies which the Conservatives are proposing would help people to make applications and safe routes into the country. And what we know is that you need those safe and legal routes, but you also need to make sure that you have the investment here so that the asylum applications can be processed in a fair and quick way. Because, at the moment, if we see people in hotel accommodation for months, years on end, that's bad for the people involved. It racks up the bill in terms of paying for all that accommodation, and it's bad for the overall system.
OK. We've just heard from Pat Cullen of the Royal College of Nursing saying that if there isn't a resolution, then we can expect strikes continuing into the new year, into January, which obviously is going to be desperate news for the NHS and it's already under pressure. Nurses have said they want a pay rise that's 5% above inflation. Is that affordable?
Well, look, as the Shadow Secretary of State for Health and others in the opposition have said, that 19%, is not going to be affordable. But the point is, there should be a negotiation about avoiding these strikes going ahead, about coming to a resolution. And, if you take a step back and think how the government have behaved in relation to the nurses and other NHS workers, and indeed different sectors across the economy and across the public sector, the government have not been willing to negotiate. They have stepped back. They have let these problems develop or go without the solution. And actually, as I said in response to one of your earlier questions, the job of government is to roll up your sleeves and try and sort out difficult problems. And this is a difficult problem, but it is one where we believe the government should roll up their sleeves, get to the negotiating table and avoid these strikes that no one wants to see happen. The nurses don't want them to go ahead.
Would you like to see the Labour government in Wales do that then as well, where there's also strikes going on?
Well, we want to see across the country strikes averted, and the point is the way
Mark Drakeford should do a bit more then.
Well, the way that you avert strikes is to negotiate with trade unions, with workers' representatives, and try and get a deal, because no one wants strikes to go ahead. The nurses do not want to go on strike. No one in any industry wants to go on strike, and the public don't want to see the strikes either. And it really is the job of government. Rather than standing back, rather than giving up because it's too hard, rather than threatening, new legislation to, as they would see it, deal with the problem, they need to roll up their sleeves, sit down at their table and negotiate a solution.
Well, I guess the government would say they've said what the offer is, because they're going to go along with the pay review body, which is around 4% for most nurses. So what would Labour's position be then?
So ultimately, it is the responsibility of government to find a solution.
Yeah, so
it's the responsibility of the government to sit down at that table.
You're the government in waiting. What would be a fair pay rise for nurses? Would it be 7.5% like they've accepted in Scotland?
Well, the point of having a negotiation is that you have that negotiation to work out what the pay deal is and what the other terms of an agreement are.
But if you're in opposition, you could put a bit of pressure on the government by saying what your position would be.
The position that we're putting the pressure on the government to do is to negotiate, is to get around the table, is to roll up their sleeves and do the difficult but critical work of government, which is to come to a solution. And that's how we would avert strikes, and that's how we'd make sure that the health service is in a better position. But if I can just say one other point, which is really important, which is that the health service has been run down. It's been run down for 12 years, and pay is a really important issue, but it's also a lack of staff. There's real problems with recruitment and retention, which is why we proposed the biggest expansion of the NHS workforce in its history, funded by scrapping the non-dom tax status.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today, explaining some of Labour's proposals, James Murray, there. Time now to take a closer look at today's Prime Minister's questions. Now, of course, the news of those deaths in the English Channel overshadowed proceedings, but it was the strikes that were focused on by Keir Starmer. Here's what our political correspondent Joe Pike made of it all in PMQs Unwrapped.
Today's session started with tributes to those caught up in the English Channel migrant tragedy.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will share my sorrow at the capsizing of a small boat in the Channel in the early hours of this morning and the tragic loss of human life.
It's a reminder that the criminal gangs running those routes put the lives of the desperate at risk and profit from their misery. They must be broken up and brought to justice.
Tomorrow, members of the Royal College of Nursing will go on strike for the first time in their history. So today, Keir Starmer chose to focus on that industrial action and attempted to argue it's the government's fault for not negotiating.
All the Prime Minister has to do to stop that is to open the door and discuss pay with them. After 12 years of Tory failure, winter has arrived for our public services, and we've got a Prime Minister who has curled up in a ball and gone into hibernation.
Now, Keir Starmer's team believe that because strikes are so widespread and because voters know life is tough and the cost of living is real, there is an instinctive resonance with the plight of strikers. In contrast, Rishi Sunak's allies argue that Sir Keir is, yet again, ignoring reality to score political points.
The honourable gentleman says to get round the table, but we all know what that means, Mr. Speaker. That is just simply a political formula for avoiding taking a position on this issue. If he thinks it's right that pay demands of 19% are met, then he should say so.
And it all soon descended into familiar and not entirely relevant territory.
He's too weak to stand up to the tax avoiders.
He's not strong enough to stand up to the union.
As usual, Mr. Speaker, he tries to blame everyone else.
If we'd listened to him, Mr. Speaker, the backlog would still be growing, and that's because we'd still be in lockdown.
Keir Starmer's final question of the final PMQs this year focused on a point of policy agreement the war in Ukraine.
Millions will spend Christmas in sub-zero temperatures without heating, electricity or hot water. Their suffering is unimaginable, but their bravery is awe-inspiring.
This Christmas, many families will be laying an extra place at their Christmas table, and that speaks to the generosity and compassion of our nation, and long may that continue.
Throughout today's questions, there was a festive feel, but with a distinctly bleak outlook.
Ordinary families are facing a Dickensian nightmare across the country this Christmas.
We know it's Christmas, but the party's not started yet.
This year, the Tory party has given us 5 education secretaries, 4 chancellors, 3 prime ministers, 2 leadership coups. And Mr. Speaker, the Partridges had to sell the pear tree to pay the gas.
After yet another year of political perma-crisis, MPs seem desperate for their Christmas break. PMQs is back in 4 weeks' time, and all the same challenges. The war in Ukraine, the NHS, public sector pay seem sure to feature again.
Well, Jerry was mentioning the Christmas break there, and it does feel, doesn't it, that it's a good point, because it's our last show of the year as well. We're back in early January to reflect on what a year it's been. It's been extraordinary, hasn't it? So let's bring in our viewers panel at this point, shall we? I asked them to have a little think about who their politician of the year is. So now it's time to find out. I'm going to go to Vic first. Vic Daniels, Conservative, talking to us from West London. Now, Vic, you've got 3 politicians of the year, but you've told Jared, our producer, that you're going to say all of it in 60 seconds. So that's your challenge. Who's your politician of the year?
All right. OK, so Liz Truss, who famously said on becoming Prime Minister, "I'm ready to hit the ground on day one." And she did. Matt Hancock, defying his political masters and going into the jungle, surviving and thriving there, and emerging with a new book out, enhanced her career prospects and a love-hate relationship with Boy George. To sum up the year, as Boris said on leaving office, them's the breaks. And on the final show of the year for the tape, hasta la vista, baby.
Amazing. I think that was pretty short and sweet, I have to say. And what a year it's been. It did kind of sum up the roller coaster of it, definitely. Right, let's bring in Mike Munro next, shall we? You are a swing voter, perhaps more to the right. You're talking to us from Hampshire. Who's your politician of the year?
Well, you may think I'm more to the left when I can you read that? Mick Lynch.
There you go.
The reason
being
Lynch? Is he, in interviews I've seen him in, he's very competent handling the ridiculous nonsense that politicians throw at him. He just doesn't accept the what they come up with, and we've just heard waffle from the Health Minister. Total, just parroting some kind of policy that means nothing, doesn't achieve an end.
Well, I have to say, he's certainly been one of the political characters of the year. I think perhaps lots of us weren't familiar with Mick Lynch this time last year. That's certainly, it couldn't be said to be the case now. Right, let's bring in Iza Bhattacharjee now, shall we? You describe yourself as a Lib Dem/Labour voter. You're talking to us from London. Who's your politician of the year?
I wrote down Liz Truss, but not in a good way. I think in part he precipitated like massive economic crises this year, and at the same time has set the kind of thing up now.
It does feel, doesn't it, like Liz Truss is going to be one of those politicians that we will always remember. It kind of feels like you're living through history, the shortest serviced ever Prime Minister. Belinda Campbell, swing voter, you're talking to us from Twickenham in West London. Who's your politician of the year?
Keir Starmer, because he comes across as very authentic with his emotions. He shows them really well. I can feel his frustration. He speaks for the people. He doesn't give up. He really tries to put his points across with a lot of emotion, and they're believable.
Interesting stuff. I thought there might be a Keir Starmer somewhere today. Let's talk to Bruce Tyler next, shall we? Conservative voter from East Riding of Yorkshire. Who did you go for?
Well, you're breaking up a bit there, Sophie, but my choice is Jeremy Hunt. I think he stepped up to the plate to do the job when many would not have done. Would be interested to know whether other people were asked before him. But he's done a great job stepping into the void and preventing the economy descending into the depths. We saw sterling descend to $1.03. We saw the 2-year yield on gilts descend increase to 4.7%. Both of those have been turned around by 20% since then, and the economy has stabilised. And I think he's done a very, very good job in doing that.
It does feel like we're learning a bit more about just how close things got with the pension funds at that point, doesn't it? Really interesting analysis there. Right, let's finally go to Aroyca St John Mildmay. You're a centre-left voter and you're talking to us from Norfolk. Who is your politician of the year?
Well, that is Theresa May, and I am left-leaning, and I think actually the Conservatives are mostly very dense and unresponsive to the needs of the country. But in a spirit of respect and appreciation, and perhaps even Christmas, I do nominate Theresa May because she did something 7 years ago, which was she brought in coercive and controlling behaviour into the legal framework of domestic abuse as Section 76 in the Domestic Violence Crime Act. And now it's entered common parlance and understanding amongst loads of potential victims before they get dragged under. And so, you know, I didn't say that she was like the woman of the moment, but actually what she did before has come to life. So I say Merry Christmas, Mrs. May. I'm not a Conservative voter by instinct.
But you are going in for
say,
Theresa May. Really interesting to hear all of your views. Great range there. Theresa May, just one of three former Conservative Prime Ministers on the backbenches. We're in Westminster. Next up, we're going to be rounding up everything we just heard with Sam Coates.
From the very beginning of this big war, since March, myself and many other Ukrainian politicians were promoting one very simple and clear narrative. A big part of Ukrainian victory is not just defeating Russians on Ukrainian soil, but bringing into accountability everyone who committed war crimes in Ukraine. Because without justice based on international law, it's important to expect peaceful and comfortable future. For this very moment, it's not my wish. It's a joint, consolidated view of G7. Just 2 days ago, G7 spread its latest communique, and let me quote, there can be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities. We will hold President Putin and those responsible to account in accordance with international law. So it's not my wish anymore. It's not the wish of President Zelensky or all other Ukrainians. That's the consolidated understanding of the West. But the challenge is not only to bring Russian leadership to accountability, but to bring into accountability everyone who committed war crimes. And at the moment, I can report to you that Ukrainian officials registered more than 70,000 crimes related to Russian aggression. More than 50,000 war crimes has been detected by Ukrainian law enforcement. All that require absolutely huge efforts from prosecutors, from experts, from investigators, and definitely it's a huge task for Ukrainian judiciary system and for Ukrainian judges, because it's understood for today that yes, top Russian leaders will brought into prosecution through International Tribunal Court. I hope so. I recently came back from Hague, and International Criminal Court in Hague is working extremely hard to have a good result with this. But all these thousands of war crimes definitely will be considered by Ukrainian courts. We already are doing this. The training of Ukrainian judges is extremely important because no one in this world has enough capabilities and enough experience to proceed with such a huge amount of war crimes.
Welcome back to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, we've just been hearing what our viewers panel made of the year, but it's right to, I think, reflect, shall we, with Sam, our Deputy Political Editor. And Sam, we've covered some pretty extraordinary years in British politics recently, but I mean, this year has been just utterly flabbergasting, hasn't it? What are your moments of the year?
I think there are three to mention in particular. Let's look at the first one. Now, we spent a lot of the first 6 months talking about parties, but here's the thing, Sophie. I don't think parties eventually did for Boris Johnson, who was ousted just before the summer. I think he was in a very rocky position even this time last year. In the end, it was a different scandal about a minister's misconduct that got him over the edge. So this might be remembered, but was it the really important moment? Perhaps not, because there was so much else this year. If we look at the next one, you've got Jeremy Hunt. And actually, the really turbulent period this year was Liz Truss's premiership. And this is the moment where Jeremy Hunt reversed the mini-budget that got her into all that trouble. Many assumed, many still believe, that was a political act. But we now know that that morning, it turned out there was a financial firm, a pension firm, about to go under. That is why they did it. And here is Boris Johnson coming back after Liz Truss has defenestrated to try and become leader. Here's the thing we've learned this week, I've learned this week. I don't think he ever really had the numbers. He didn't get over 100 people who uniquely signed up to his campaign. That's the belief amongst some on the 1922.
It really feels, with everything moving so quickly, we're almost learning history as it goes. Thank you so much, Sam. That's it for The Take. It's been a lot of fun to follow this year with you. We'll be back in January.